So first, thank you, Manolo. That was a lovely talk. I'm very sympathetic to Shannon information as the main, and in my opinion, indeed, only needed notion of information, something I've maintained for years now. Further, that developing a distinct notion of information for neuroscience simply misses both the way that neuroscientists actually work, including myself, and the concepts and tools I use when I'm working in neuroscience, and the depth of tools available in information theory. So it's very nice to bring that out. Very rich talk, and there's many points of contact, many things that I'm curious about. But if I take off my neuroscience cap, so to speak, and put on my philosopher's cap, which is a hat that maybe is not so comfortable sometimes, I am a little confused about the, maybe perhaps the purpose of the account. And I think one nice way of drawing out further what your intent or goal is here of providing the account, as well as illustrating my concern, is the following. It seems to me that one could have source coding and channel coding without any semantic properties at all. So typically when we think about representation, we think that representations have semantic properties. They're about something, they have content. But the message passed over information processing pipeline does not need to be about anything. For example, some system may be able to determine which of n messages a particular system is mapped onto, a particular signal is mapped onto. The sender may code their message by assigning it to some letter, say to the alphabet of some alphabet. To make the example simple, you can let the message be the letter itself, and then sends that signal over a noisy channel, and a receiver can get that signal and decode the message sent, but nothing in this simple system requires content. And so I'm wondering, I'm not necessarily sympathetic to this objection, but I think there are many philosophers who may wonder in what sense this is about representation at all. Of course, Shannon theory of information is the mathematical theory of communication, and someone might say that this is just about signals and signaling systems and communication, and not necessarily about representation. I might add again that I don't necessarily think this, I'm not even sure, on every other day, I don't believe there are semantic properties. On the even days, I think there are, so I'm not even sure how I feel about this, but I think that it'd be interesting to hear what you have to say about that kind of objection.
Thanks. So I think that here it's quite sensible to listen to Dredske of all people. So the main idea I take it, so the most kind of successful or perhaps durable idea in Dredske's work is to realize that the world is the source. So the idea would be, you're right, that you can have asemantic sources, but there's no need for that to be the case. So typically won't be the case. So typically, for evolved information processing systems, the source will have values which will be, already kind of perfectly reasonable candidates for content. So the source would be perhaps environmental configurations that follow certain natural statistics, say, and then what you transmit is that the world around me is like this right now, something like that. So that I think that's perfectly reasonable. And in the case in which you say, the source is asemantic, it's just symbols and so on. Well, I'm very much inclined to, bite the bullet here and say that because I'm, find attractive the idea that the source values are actually the contents, then those asemantic things are just the representata. So they don't need to be semantic. So trees are not semantic, and these asemantic thingies are not semantic either, but that's fine.
So you're okay, I'm a little confused by that very last point. So just to clarify, you're okay with relinquishing semantic properties, with just going with the formal theory of communication?
No, well, I mean, I think that semantic properties are just a way to discuss features of the formal theory of communication. So, I mean, of a theory of communication that can be formalized along Shannonian lines. So let me say again what I was trying to say. So I was giving you this case in which you have a source which for values S1, S2, S3, S4. What are these things? Nobody cares, but these are the represented entities. So these 4 values. What are they? We don't know. but they come from the source, and we are representing, our signals are representing the source. That's what they are doing. So if the source is, say, sunny, cloudy, snowy, then fine. But if it's S1, S2, S3, that's fine too. It's just that, you know, it's not going to be a very interesting from the semantic point of view representational system, but you know, the semantic properties of the signals are that they refer to S1, S2, S3, S4.
Okay, so it seems like you're really assuming a lot of representational structure in giving your account of your information processing account of representation, right? So this gets back to the bigger question that I started my first question with, excuse me, which is this meant to be like an explication of representation? Is this really a theory of representation, or are you kind of assuming a representational framework of some sort in your reply to the first question? You invoke Dretske, who of course famously has a causal theory of information.
I think it's a theory of representation. So you say so representations are just the thing that encode world values, say. So they encode source values, and source values can be anything, as you were rightly saying. But you know, sometimes they will be values which we identify with things out there, extramental entities, which seem like perfectly good contents for signals to have. So, you know, I just say, if you follow me in saying that representations are just signals in information processing pipelines, then you will find that this thing kind of, you know, matches fairly well, perhaps imperfectly, to pre-theoretic representational talk. So the signals would be the representations, and the representata would be the values of the source. Something like that. So I don't think I'm assuming representational machinery as much as kind of providing a rough and ready translation manual or something like that.
Right. So you do intend it to be an explication of the notion.
Yeah,
I mean, so. It would be surely a useful contribution, even if you were to say, for example, that there are open questions and you may be assuming a causal theory of content determination, and yet you can still use the tools of information theory to separate what I call central cases from peripheral cases. But it seems like you actually want this to carry more meat on the bones. And let me just say that, you know, while I personally am sympathetic to that enterprise, and also I am not convinced that there even are content properties in the world, which I know sounds crazy and is super outside the mainstream of philosophy. But I think that there are philosophers who will say that that there work remains to be done, let's say, in order to make good on the claim that this really is a theory of representation. Let me move on to a second question to get your response to the second question, which is that if we do take on good faith the claim that this is a theory of representation, then a concern I have is that representation takes on some sort of unreal, or there's an irrealism about representation. Potentially anything can be part of an information processing pathway. A system can use potentially anything as a signal to send to another system. And further, the view suggests that, and we're taking on good faith, that in order to be a representation, it must be usefully treated as part of such an information processing pathway. But then it does seem that there's an irrealism about representation. To be a representation is just to be used as a signal in information processing pathway. But then it seems like there's core cases of representation that are objective, and I'm unclear on what the difference is between the core and periphery, or indeed, you know, what's to stop representations sort of being everywhere.
Right. So no, I don't think that's. I mean, I don't think that that problem is so severe, because I think that information processing pipelines have all sorts of theological you know, requirements. So for instance, I was discussing, let me just get to, right. So I was saying that in order for lossy compression to make sense, you know, to be you know, well defined as a problem, you need a distortion measure. And you know, then you're going to be, you know, co-opting all of the developments in other theories of metasemantic, naturalistic metasemantic accounts of representation, and you're going to say, so this distortion measures are going to be something like Tilio functions of the information processing pipeline or pathways and so on. And nothing, forces me to say that every signal that varies with every other signal is supposed to, be responsive to one distortion measure of other or other. That's just not the case. So if you take most of the people, I think, who are, Bretty, for instance, in this recent paper in BBS, he's very skeptical about representations and encoding and so on. But he seems to think that encoding and representation are just, as I was saying at the beginning, this kind of associations between variables. And of course, you're right, and he's right, and everyone is right, association between variables is very cheap. But this is not as cheap as that. Here you need something to be, so you have, for instance, if you want to think of it this way, you have to have some notion of task relevance. So that signal is there for some reason to transmit information that's going to be guiding this or that motor programs or whatever, and that's going to be given by some further matters of fact that perhaps teleofunctional in nature or some other things. So I don't think that this arbitrariness or trivialization worry runs very deep.
So there is this sort of teleofunctional component to the account that's underlying it, which would basically provide further constraints on which uses are.
Not further constraints, I think, David. I'm sorry, no, go on. I don't want to interrupt.
I was just saying that it seems like when you were invoking these sort of teleosemantic backbone for the account, the way that I hear that is that there are some further constraints regarding selection or selective processes that must underlie the use of particular messages or the development of the sending system and the receiving system, such that some uses of certain physical states get counted as signals and others don't because they're the result of this kind of selective process. Is that right?
Right. So the thing is, you don't want to think of this as information plus function, as you would think of Dredge's account, say. Well, the thing is, in order to have an information processing, so something that counts as source coding, source coding is a teleofunctional notion. So source coding means you're compressing this, and in order to have a shorter description of the same thing, or a shorter description that meets some distortion constraint or goal or whatever. So I mean, the information theoretic formalism, as we know it and love it, is suffused with teleofunctional notion. So no, it's not that I want to have an extra kind of backbone. I mean, backbone is fine, but I mean, we shouldn't think of this as a kind of further moving part of the theory. So in order for the theory to apply, you need to have those things.
So it's a welcome revelatory aspect. You're saying it's already built into the system. Right, awesome. Yeah. Very good.
Thanks.
Thank you. Please, can you turn on your camera?
Yep.
Okay, jump in.
Is it working? Can you see me?
I can't. And now, hello.
Hello, hi.
Yes.
So first of all, thank you for a very exciting paper. I'm super excited about it, and I think that it's been a long time coming that philosophers started to take information theory really seriously. And I'm very happy to see that there's this tide now coming with many people, and you among them, who are starting to treat information theory more seriously. So maybe I'll start by following up on David's last question, because I was also wondering about how observer relative or dependent on the perspective of the investigator your notion of representation is. And the reason why I got worried about that is because you write in the paper, for example, on page 12, you write, "My thesis, I claimed, is that some entity counts more centrally as a representation the more theoretically fruitful it is to apply the minimal concept to its behavior." And of course, what I immediately got worried about is this theoretical fruitfulness, because what we take to be theoretically fruitful is not only very fuzzy, but also seems to be completely arbitrary.
Right.
And now you seem, in response to David, you said that, well, there's also this teleofunctional component there, latent in your account, but I'm not entirely sure that this completely solves the worry, because what we take, for example, the task function to be is still somewhat might be somewhat dependent on the perspective of the researcher, depending on what teleofunctional account they're working with, right? So, for example, Millikan and more recently Gualtiero Piccinini have completely different accounts of what it makes something a proper function, for example. And I was wondering whether I could like push you a little bit to maybe say something more on that, on this aspect.
So in footnote 3 of the paper, I take this up, but very briefly and not I'm sure not satisfactory enough for anyone. But I say there, this fruitfulness requirement, so to say, should be read in a way compatible with realism of representations. And how would that work? The features of representations that are relevant to comparing them core status are the ones that make it theoretically fruitful or worthwhile to study them under the analytical lens of a minimal concept. So the idea is not that, whatever tickles your fancy, right? So if you find this theoretically fruitful, knock yourself out and have a representation. That's not the idea. The idea is that there are some hard constraints on what brains or languages are doing that make it fruitful to study them by this kind of tools. So take, for instance, the lexicon of color terms, so it's color-related terms. Mm-hmm. So it just so happens that color-related terms sit very closely to this rate distortion boundary for a distortion measure called the bottleneck principle, which is a important measure. So if the world were not like that, if we're not to cooperate, it would not be fruitful. These people would have looked into a system. They would have found that there was no purchase on treating them as efficient coding of color space, and that would have been it, right? So it is fruitful because it is true, so to say. I mean, that's my kind of off the bat, ready response to this trivialization worry. So I take Piccinini and Millikan to disagree on the right way of. So if you want to describe what they're doing in the terms that I prefer, they are disagreeing on what the loss function for a certain processing pipeline is, right? So how should we calculate a loss function for a certain natural system? Ruth says this, Gualtiero says that, and the facts are what they are.
Okay, I think that's a very interesting answer, because if you treat this disagreement as a disagreement about the loss function, then you you extract something that's empirically testable there, right? You have different ways of framing the loss function, and now you can test them empirically, or hopefully you can test them empirically to see whether one is more delivers more promising empirical results than the other. Okay, so
can I say something about this? So you can, that's true, but you need an extra premise, and is that the system works close to optimality. So right, and that's of course, I mean, who knows, right? So I'm buying into the whole computational rationality framework here, and if we're wrong about this, and then all bets are off. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Okay. So the second question also tails behind one of David's questions, because I'm a little bit worried about which aspect of representation your review is really an account of. Mm-hmm. So, as I'm sure you and many people know, many authors, most prominently Bill Ramsey, claim that the theory or account of representation should provide a satisfying account of two aspects of representation, right? The functional aspect, what it means for something to play the role of a representation in a system of interest, and the semantic aspect. So what does it mean for something to play, something playing this functional role to carry content, and how does it handle misrepresentation and so on? And of course, there's a lot of debate whether these aspects can be really separated. So for example, in his book that you also mentioned, Nick Shea points out that if you have an account of misrepresentation, that already gives you a lot of information about what would count as a functional representation and so on. But my worry here specifically is that you give a very good account, and information theory more broadly can really well illuminate the functional aspect of a representation, what it means for something to function as a representation in an information processing pipeline, right? You give us an account of identifying these information processing pipelines that are relevant for representation, but I'm worried that in some aspects your semantic account or the semantic aspect of your account is a little bit lacking. And my main issue here is that the kind of misrepresentation that information theory affords here, which is misrepresentation as infidelity, encoding, or transfer of the signal, does not exhaust the philosophically and psychologically interesting cases of misrepresentation. So one way to think about it is to consider the case of sensory receptors misfiring, right? In some cases, there will be false positives in detection of environmental properties or features, such that there will be perfect fidelity in transfer and in encoding and transfer in the informational pipeline, but the input into the encoder, so the source, will already be misrepresenting the world. And I imagine, just to kind of get ahead of myself and your answer, I imagine that what you will say is that, well, we can extend the information pipeline into the world. The world is, as you said earlier, the source in these stories. But I'm a little bit worried that there might be cases where this won't work out so well. And I'm a little bit worried how far we are allowed to extend this pipeline, because it seems that once again, there's some arbitrariness holding in when we have to extend what we count as the source, encoder, and the channel.
Okay. Can I go on?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so the first point is this paper is squarely within the functional question. So I'm not almost at all trying to say anything about the semantic question. So you're totally right. Hopefully, I hope it's not because the account cannot be extended in that direction. That's the next thing I need to do, but it's just that I haven't done it. So totally true. I have said something about this in another paper of mine, which is called Representation of Rate Distortion and Sweet Spots. And there I try to say something about the other question, but also there very little. So I'm going to be saying more in the future. But you could so here I'm just saying we should identify. So we should see information processing pipelines and try to identify properties of those pipelines that are the ones that guide our calling signals their representations. And I was suggesting that this is kind of substantial coding business that does that. Then kind of the most kind of straightforward way to say, and then with semantic content, well, whatever the encoding system is doing. So if the encoding system is producing this signal when that wordly configuration is happening, or when that set of wordly configurations are happening, then that's the content, right? So this signal maps onto those things. So that's the content, period. But that's not perhaps very nice. So you want to kind of also, you don't want to say the content of a signal is this configuration or that or that or that. You want to say it's tree, right, or something like that. So when you have cardinal cells, Jennifer Aniston cells, you want to say the content of that thing is Jennifer Aniston, and just giving a catalog of everything that the signal is produced in response to wouldn't help you with that. So I agree with that, and that needs more work, and haven't done that work. So I don't have an answer for you right now. That's point number one. Point number two, I would certainly say that the source is the world. So I don't think it's a good idea. I mean, sometimes it's not, right? Sometimes you have meta cognitive representations, and then the right way to think of the source is all the upstream brain states. But typically, and certainly for perceptual representations, the world is going to be the source. And now, how far into the world can we go? I think we can just take all the world and be done with it. So we just think of the world as a multivariate probability distribution, and we make, for the moment, no assumptions as to the ontology of things out there. We don't think of it in terms of shapes or trees or anything. We just take in the whole thing, and we figure out by using those tools that we were discussing, by Piccinini or Millikan or whomever, we figure out what's the loss function, and then we can figure out, okay, so this responding to this particular aspect, this particular marginal distribution of the whole thing. But I don't think, in this kind of from this kind of God's eye perspective of information theory for cognitive science, you don't need to make a decision as to what the world, how deep into the world you go. You just take in the world and then you record what the actual system is doing.
All right, guys, do I have a little bit more time, or should we defer?
Maybe it's better if we finish the first round,
Okay.
and then it's pretty likely that we can have more time.
All right, because so I have a point to follow up on that, but let's wait until the...
Well, if that's a quick follow-up, just go ahead.
Okay, so thanks, Manolo. So I thought that you will say that. So my worry here was a bit like something like this. So for example, if you take light sensitive cells on the retina, right, as the source in one pipeline, a misfiring of such cell, when there's no external stimulation, will kind of be encoded, right, and passed on, and there will be a misrepresentation there, even though the encoding might have gone well and the rest of the pipeline is functioning well. And then I thought, if you extend it to the world, it's difficult to say that the source of the stimulation is the object in the world. It seemed to me that what you would have to say is that the light sensitive receptor is actually the channel over which information from the source, which is the light, is transmitted. And what worries me there is that you might end up with an account of representation where all the contents are proximal contents. Right. And I'm not entirely sure that this is a welcome solution, so to speak. So Karen Neander, for example, does think that for some cases, I know, but you must agree that saying that distal properties are objects and proximal properties are objects are the contents, those two options give you very different accuracy conditions, right? So this is kind of what I'm a little bit worried here, that there's going to be some ambiguity there.
That's a very fair point. I mean, I said it would be catastrophic if we only got proximal contents, right? I agree with that. I wouldn't want that. So no, the world luckily has lots of structure. So when you get what a Gibsonian would call the energy array, that thing is connected to, well, I mean, they would say things like, the energy array extends into, properties which are affordance relevant. So, right, so you have this, so you can think of it perhaps as a Bayesian net. So you have this kind of node, which is hidden out there, and that node produces a perceptible syndrome of, reflectancies and colors and noises and so on. And you detect those things. By detecting those things, you are inferring the presence of that node which is producing this. So you can think of it as a hidden Markov process or something like that. And again, in that paper, I was alluding to that this representations are distortion sweet spots. You get precisely that. So a system which is compressing something just using perceptible nodes can still carry a lot of information about those both more distal nodes.
All right. Thanks a lot. And sorry for going over time.
Thank you, Chris.
No worry. That's fun. Now, last discussant here is Charles Rathkoph. We invite Charles to open the camera. I really hope that some of the attendees might have time for their questions too. So can you do it in 11 minutes, say?
Yeah, can you see me?
I cannot.
Hold on. Now?
I can see a C and an R.
Wait, sorry, what did you say?
I see a C and an R, which stand for you, but are not you.
Okay. All right, now the green light is on next to my camera.
Okay. Yeah, I can see it.
Oh, you see me now? Okay. And obviously you hear me. Okay, good. Thank you, Manolo, for the very nice talk. Lots of questions. Let's see. Maybe I want to start off by saying what I find most helpful and most fruitful about the main ideas in the paper. So going back to something David said, the theory he asked whether this is really a theory of representation or not. And I think when you use that phrase, a theory of representation, it's ambiguous, and Chris already alluded to that. So one thing you could be asking for when you ask for a theory of representation is sort of a means by which to sort all representations into one category and all non-representations into another category. Another thing you could mean is you want a theory which helps you understand what makes a representation a good representation, rather mediocre one or a bad one. And I think what I like best about the views that you presented so far is that they really help with that latter project. I agree completely that we have to think both about compression and about robustness and protecting signals and how biological systems manage to do that. It's only by studying those sorts of more interesting channel relevant properties that you can test optimality hypotheses. And so, yeah, I'm completely on board there. And that's sort of like, in a way, you could just summarize that by saying this is good general advice to neuroscientists to think about these properties and allow them to play a guiding role in formulating research questions and setting up experiments. Now, the thing that I have like a tick when it comes to thinking about lower level information in the brain. So my question is going to be about how to think about your views when applied to neural structures rather than cognitive systems in a more abstract sense. And my tick that I always come back to is this contrast between the task of the neurobiologist and the task of the computer scientist. And to me, what's always salient is that for a computer scientist, the things that count as the signals are sort of given because we are the architects of the system. And in biology, that's not the case. So we have to do two things as biologists. We have to measure and test whether the signals and messages are being encoded well or poorly, and figure out how well or poorly. But we also have to identify those signals and messages in the first place, and the channels in the first place. So I'm unclear about what your view is committed to on that latter question. So here's a way of sort of a roundabout way of asking that same question that's been going through my mind a bunch. So is it possible that information theoretic tools would help us to identify, let's say, a new neural channel, because the physiological properties, the quantitative properties of that channel do a very impressive job of demonstrating to us that signals and messages are encoded in a near optimal way. And so we have this hypothesis that's somehow driven by neural data. But then we move out to the behavioral level and we observe the organism as a whole, and we just, in its behavior, we apply Dennett's intentional sort of stance, and we just get no traction. We don't see what this channel could be contributing to the overall economy of the organism. Is that a logically possible case given your view? I mean, or is the identification of signals, the identification of messages, and the identification of channels always derivative from the observation of behavior?
No, I think it's a coherent scenario. So you're right that what I see, the question of trying to identify the project of trying to identify an information processing pipeline is kind of bootstrapping things. So you start with mere correlations, and then you have a hunch as to what this correlation might be doing. I mean, this is how science has worked in this area, and then you say something like, well, supposing that this is doing what it's doing optimally or near optimally, then what is it doing? And I think it's entirely possible that sometimes you have a neatly packaged signal that, because so for instance, suppose that you have, as we now know, we have lots of reentrant information that help modulate the turning curve of neurons, right? So depending on the process, the project that you're currently engaged in, your neuron will start behaving some way or other. So we can think, let's suppose that those, given some information as to what the current focus of interest is, those turning curves are optimal, so that they are kind of sending information within the limitation of the system as well as possible. It might still be that information about what is task relevant might be a misrepresentation. So it might be, we have wrongly sent a signal to concentrate on some, feature of the environment that is not relevant right now. And so you get these turning curves that are optimized for, say, color, but actually the thing right now is detecting some other thing. And so you would get this mismatch that you were discussing about. This mismatch between behavioral apparent behavior and what the actual computation or the actual information theory would say the thing is doing. So I don't think that's incoherent. I guess I'm committed to saying that it's comparatively infrequent, or that you still need a fair amount of good cases in order for you to delineate the different components of these pipelines correctly and so on. But they can punctually fail, of course.
Okay, that's a very helpful answer. Yeah, I think I agree with most of it, but I got to digest a little more. Do I have time for a sort of unrelated, but well, maybe it's related, a small follow-up question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I didn't hear Mark or Fabrizio. Okay, so early on, when you were just introducing information theory as measures of association, the sort of more boring parts of information theory, you made a brief claim, I think in parentheses, that there are some cases where you can have a random variable, and when you find out the value of that variable, it can increase the entropy of the second variable rather than decrease. Could you just expand on that point? I assume that this is closely connected to cases of misrepresentation. It's closely connected to cases where the value of the initial variable, the dependent variable, if you like, is somehow misleading or incomplete, or has missing values, or values that ought not be there. So in a mathematical sense, I suppose I understand the idea, but in a physical system or in a biological system, what would it mean to say that a random variable can increase the entropy, or knowledge of a random variable can increase the entropy of another?
So let me give you first the mathematical intuition, and then we can both think together what a relevant natural case might look like. So the thing is as follows. Suppose that you have your variable of interest is S, and S and T happen together. So suppose that the entropy of S is, say, 1 bit. But it just may so happen that when T is the case, that's a particularly bad. When T1 is the case, that's a particularly bad situation in which the entropy of that variable is actually 2 bits, right? So it just so happens that in the T1 cases, T1 might be something like, okay, so let me give you this example. So suppose that it's typically raining, but sometimes it's sunny. And you can see at some person, carrying sunglasses and umbrellas, and that gives you information about the weather. But perhaps this person is equally likely to carry sunglasses when it's rainy or sunny, because they just don't like whatever, but they always carry umbrellas only if it's raining. So in that case, there's some entropy of the weather system. The signal that is carrying an umbrella carries perfect information about what's happening in the weather system, but when they carry sunglasses, all bets are off. It's actually equally likely that it's rainy than that it's sunny, right? So that particular signal actually makes things worse for you. You can bet less accurately on the weather than you could before seeing the signal. Now, how and when would that happen in a natural system, and whether that's related to misinformation? That's a very good question. I have a hunch, as you do, that it is related, but I would need to think about it more.
To put it, I guess, in a flat-footed way, in your little example, the sunglasses sort of corrupt the signal from the umbrella.
Yeah. So you never supposedly you never carry both umbrella and sunglasses. Perhaps you just, when the person has carries sunglasses, an umbrella, that's always because it's raining. But when they carry sunglasses, it could be half and half. And there are systems like that. Many things happen which are like that. So you have a very good signal, and you have some other signal which is kind of the unlucky one. And
Okay.
but I'm struggling to find a more relevant example right now.
Yeah, I think here the details really matter. I need more time to think through it also.
Me too. But I mean, anyway, what's also the case is that on average, signals can only reduce the entropy. So they can or leave it as it is or reduce it. But it can't happen that on average, observing some other signal would increase the entropy of, so what cannot happen is that the entropy condition on some other signal be higher than the unconditional entropy. So on average, you reduce entropy, but for particular signals, all bets are off.
Thanks, Ross. And now, since we have still quite a few attendees online, I wonder whether some of them are willing to make a question. Stage, in order to make question, yeah, you need to do like Stephen just did. So let me unmute him. Welcome.
Hello, can you hear me?
I can, yes.
Great, hi Manolo. Thanks very much for the talk. That was music to my ears, as you can possibly imagine. Can you see my? You can't see my video. Sorry.
No, I can just hear you, but good to hear you anyway.
Great. I'm going to ask what I think is a constructive question. In Millikan's teleosemantics, at least, maybe not in Neander's or Dretski's, but certainly in Millikan's, there are two fundamental kinds of representational content. One is descriptive; it says what the world is like. The other is directive; it says what ought to be done about it. Essentially, I wonder whether you have any comments on that. It's pretty clear that information theory, as we usually talk about it, and as everybody's been talking about it so far, only deals with the first kind. Do you think anything can be said about the second kind within your formal framework?
You know what? That's again, like I was saying to Chris before with the semantic question. That's kind of on my to-do list because I mean it's particularly embarrassing that I don't have a theory about that, because I use imperative content for other business when I have my philosopher of mind hat. So I should definitely say something about that. Let me tell you what I think might be kind of said, but I don't have a theory again, so I cannot answer your question, I'm afraid. But you can at least say what Skirms says. So you can say these things carry information both, so signals carry information both about the input side and the output side. So they also carry information about what's gonna, and now we're talking about this association measure of information, so mutual information and things like that. So they carry both information about states and they carry information about the decoded version of the states, which you can call acts if you want, or depending on the formalism will be something or other. So what people typically say, what I have said in print, talking about different issues, is that you get something which is predominantly imperative if the mutual information between the signal and the output side is higher than the mutual information between the signal and the input side. So what this is doing, so I mean that's kind of a rough and ready answer of where the thing might lead to or something, but that doesn't cohere very well with my current project, because here I'm saying that you need the whole thing. You need the input side, and you need the signals, and you need the processing in order for something to kind of come up as a representation. So it would be cheating for me to now recoil to the Skirmsian or Dretskian understanding of information as this kind of mere association with input or output side. And there I have to stop because I don't have a theory of how something should be thought of as a representation in the imperative sense, I'm afraid.
That's great, thanks.
So far so good, but there is still some time for other questions. So to restate, if an attendee is willing to make a question, the only thing you need to do is to press the raise hand button, which is pretty much self-explicating. It's shaped like a hand. Because otherwise, okay, we have Steve, because otherwise also the discussants could make a second round. Welcome, Steve.
Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Hi, Manolo. It's good to
How are you?
hear your talk.
All good friends today. Very nice.
What'd you say?
No, just good friends today, which is very nice. Yeah.
Oh, nice. Yeah. Well, I also, of course, was really sympathetic to the idea in general, and I think I just I wanted to say ask a little bit more about the constraints on the loss function or the distortion function, which I feel sort of like a theme. I guess I'm having trouble coming up with a good example, but it feels like, as you say, information theory is good about sort of teasing out complex correlations. So it feels like there could be this complex system where it's really fruitful to have this, loss function defined and dig up all sorts of interesting correlations, but where we wouldn't be inclined to call that a representation. And, I mean, maybe one example, this is sort of pressing also on the question of what counts as a representation, but like clearly in the case of computers, applying this kind of information theoretic approach is very fruitful. And yet there's at least some sense where we'd be reluctant to call that intentional or, representational in the sense of full-blown intentionality. So I guess I wasn't clear on.
Okay. Is that it?
Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Yeah. So I thought your question was going to go in another direction, but let me take the actual question you asked, and then the question I thought you were going to ask. So about the question you did ask, I guess I'm not particularly, I'm a liberal representationalist, I guess, and I'm happy to talk of intentional properties in the representational sense for many different things. So I think I agree with both Charles and Rosakau and many others that intentionality has a kind of a personal level flavor to it, and that might kind of call for more different. So perhaps for intentionality you need some kind of rationality to happen, or you need some kind of offline simulation capabilities or something like that. I don't know, but officially I'm here just dealing with things which can be applied across the board in cognitive science and neuroscience, and therefore they apply to very simple systems and neuronal assemblies in particular, which are probably neither are intentional in that more kind of charged sense. So the answer would be I'm happy to countenance representational properties for symbols in a computer program. I mean, and it's not just me, it's the whole of computer science. You cannot do computer science without that. I mean, you really cannot. So you without the notion of a variable assignment, you cannot get the thing off the ground. So I think I'm happy with that. But I agree that there is perhaps a more Brentanonian understanding of intentionality, which calls for kind of more heavy-duty machinery than I have presented here.
So, what about like more abstract, complex systems, I guess, where you might fruitfully apply a loss function and so on, but almost no one would be inclined to, waterfall or something, where almost no one would be inclined to say there's representation there. Good.
So that's the question I thought you were going to ask, and I think is something. So I think it would be I think it's a feature, not a bug of the account, that it applies to dynamical and complex systems. So it's a feature of the account that you can show how and to what extent representational glosses over dynamical system behavior can be informative and useful. So I mean, if you say, you know, there's a representation. So, you know, when Rabinovich, for instance, talking about neural trajectories and very complicated dynamical systems and complex systems and, you know, quasi-chaotic systems and so on, you know, these things can be representations. He talks of them, these transient states, as being something like representations. And, you know, I can make sense of how that is. You know, that is because that dynamical system is approximating an information processing pipeline in this other sense. So I mean, you are a real pattern person. So what I'm saying is that information theoretic talk gets at one real pattern that, you know, is implemented quite widely so across the board in cognitive systems, even when the cognitive system in question is a dynamical system. But I mean, what would be a counterexample to the account? If you could show that the weather system does source coding or channel coding. If that was the case, that would be a problem. But you know, if you had a clearly non-intentional, clearly non-representational system like a weather system, which did something like source coding, that would be interesting.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Very good. We are almost out of time, but I think there is still time for one quick question, or two very quick questions still. This also come from David, Charles, and Chris, if they have some unresolved issue. Do you? Okay.
We just jump in? Hold on.
If you wish. Yeah, of course. You don't have to, but if you think there's something you want to express.
Yeah. I have almost a meta-philosophical kind of question. The paper and the talk refer quite a bit to this core periphery structure in the cases of representation.
What's first again, David?
The core periphery structure of cases of representation. I've thought a lot about what I call central case analysis and the way that central case analysis can be a robust philosophical tool. And something that's interesting about the way that you use this tool is that you say, and this reflects a little bit back on the question that Chris had about, you say that theoretically interesting cases of coding impose certain kinds of constraints on signals that are hallmark of core cases of representation. And I took your response to his concern. He was worried about the objectivity there, and I took you to be saying something like, well, the theoretically interesting, that phrase and that statement reflects the core versus periphery. Is that right? That's my first question.
Well, theoretically interesting reflects his facts about the world that make them interesting. That was the gist of the answer. So that it's the world that is mandating what will turn out to be fruitfully treatable along with theoretic lines. And I take that and I suggest that maps onto the core periphery distinction. Yes.
Okay, so you think that the core periphery structure is a sort of an objective fact about the structure of the cases?
That's a very good point. So the core periphery structure is a fact about the fruitfulness of application of a theory. And now the fruitfulness of application of a theory is, in its turn, dependent on facts of the world. Whether that means the core periphery structure kind of transparently be about the world, I'm not sure, because you have this thing in between. So that's a very interesting question. I don't have an answer. So did you see the structure here? So you have this kind of intentional or experimenter dependent or researcher dependent layer, and I say, but that's fine because that is discharged by the world making things interesting. And now what you're asking is, okay, but is that really transparent or is it opaque when it comes to counting something as core and peripheral?
And perhaps unsurprisingly, based on my question, I want to maintain that there is actually an objective fact of the matter about this core peripheral structure. It's not just the result of our conceptual schemes or the way we theorize about a subject matter.
Right. So then your way of answering this question I just posed for myself would be, yes, you can transparently take the core peripheral structure all the way to the world via the theoretical fruitfulness of application of these ideas.
I see. Okay, so there is a way to retain the objectivity of the structure. Okay.